going to go through a few of the major ideas, some of the major theories. So the first theory is realism, and realism is all about survival and security from a military perspective. So in this particular theory, what we're talking about is how a state like the United States or China or Russia creates security for itself using power. There are four main theories of realism. There's classical realism, there's offensive realism, there is defensive realism, and neoclassical realism. So all of these share the same assumptions that power is used to secure interests, and interests are related to this idea of survival. Survival is related to the idea of remaining an autonomous political unit within this world environment. Anarchy. So anarchy is a lack of an overarching orderer. It is a situation where there's no, like 911. You can't call another power to help you. You're on your own. Self-help system. So if you look at Ukraine, the Ukraine situation, they're on their own. The United States is helping them, but they're fighting this battle on their own. And the reason for this is because Russia sees it in their interest to attack Ukraine to secure itself. Those are the main assumptions. So you help yourself, use power, and you want to survive. But within that, we have the idea of several different interpretations of realism, or several different strains. I've mentioned those four. Classical has to do with human nature. So human beings are evil, and they're going to do some selfish things, and they're very egotistical. So they're going to do whatever it takes for them so that they can secure themselves. There's a defensive variant of realism called defensive realism, and they seek security as well, but they don't go too far in their ambition or motivation. They seek to secure their specific state, and they don't want any more power than they have, right? They just want enough to survive and to remain secure. There's also offensive realism, and offensive realism means that there's never enough power. Like states will pursue an endless amount of power, because when you think about it, security is a feeling. It is, you feel secure. But if you look at any country's history, the more they expand, the more insecure they feel. So they expand in order to feel secure, but the more they expand, the more insecure they feel. So in this regard, offensive realism really describes the world order, and it does so in a very good way, in a very productive way. Then there's neoclassical realism, and neoclassical realism has to do with opening the state up. So the other realisms don't really look at domestic factors. They just look at the military and the military's relationship to other militaries. But for neoclassical realism, they look at leaders. So Trump was very different from Obama, and Obama was very different from Bush, and Bush was different from Clinton, and Biden is different from them all. So in that respect, every leader will interact with the international system and other countries in a very different way. So it's important for us to know those distinctions for the exam. But in the end, every country just wants to survive as an autonomous political unit. But states are always worried about the intentions of others. So it's not enough just to sit back and say everything's fine. You have to understand that if a country amasses a military on your border, then that is a threat to your national security, and that it cannot be tolerated. When Zelensky saw the amount of weapons being placed on the border by Russia, he should have acted rather than he just said, "Hey, it's nothing to worry about. It's nothing. Never mind. They're not a threat." And see, that's what realism is trying to warn you. Realism is trying to warn you about the intentions of other states that may not be as pure as your own. So we have to be very mindful of that going forward when we're dealing with other countries, that their intentions may not be similar to our own. And I think that's the the liberal fallacy. We're going to talk about liberalism as well. At the end of it, states are worried about power and the power of other states because there's conflicting interests. And if there's conflicting interests, most likely war might be a possibility, especially if diplomacy has failed. So, just to summarize realism, ultimately states pursue power to attain security. In an anarchical system where you have to help yourself, self help, and that is the crux of international relations. Now, we're going to turn to liberalism. Now, liberalism is very optimistic, and it's dangerous to be optimistic in an anarchical world. Realism is very pessimistic. I'm a pessimistic guy, so I tend to be, hey, something's going to go wrong. If I'm having a good time, I say to myself, something's got to go, something's got to happen. So I got to be always on the defensive. But liberalism looks at the evolution of human society, gives a lot of credence to that, gives a lot of credence to trade, international trade, interdependence, cooperation, the birth of NGOs and other economic institutions and international regimes. So state behavior is based on perceptions of others and the decisions of elites, the economic elite, the global elite, to create a more peaceful, interdependent system. But this depends on the member states and their objectives. So if there are countries that are democracies, then they share that in common. If there's capitalist countries, they share that. Communist countries, authoritarian countries, they're not going to share the same sorts of norms that the liberal countries will share. And in many respects, a lot of people, especially in the 1990s, they thought that with the fall of the Soviet Union, everything will be fine. It's going to be honky-dory. Everything is going to be, stable. Unfortunately, with the victory of democracy and capitalism, this led to the expansion of American power and influence, and this led to the multipolar world system. But that's a realist perspective. We want to come back to the liberal perspective. Liberalism stresses the benefits of open market trade, open market exchange, free trade, free movement of foreign exchange and investment. And the thing is that this was supposed to spark interdependence. So the more interdependent you are with another country, the more likely you're going to solve your problems in a friendly, non-confrontational way. So liberals expect that democracies don't go to war with one another. This is called democratic peace theory. So the basic understanding of this is that more democracies in the world, the more peaceful the world will be. Of course, if there's an authoritarian country, democracies are going to seek what is called a crusade. They're going to try to turn that authoritarian country into a liberal country. So liberalism isn't exactly a peaceful theory. It is one that is predicated on warfare to create or to protect themselves. They need to expand democracy and expand capitalism, and this has some maleffects. Liberalism also looks at non-governmental organizations. They look at groups like PETA and Amnesty International and other such freedom-loving groups as they export democracy and freedom networks across the world. There are some organizations that help undocumented workers cross into the United States to protect or to assist in them looking for work, meaningful work in the United States. So this is advocacy. There's a lot of advocacy groups, and that has to do with enlarging the cooperative arrangements in the world system today. So there's a lot of change going on because of liberalism. It's a theory that is based on praxis. So praxis means basically put into effect, or to take a plan and put it into action. Practice. And cooperation is essential here. Every country has to cooperate to achieve this national goal. So if, let's say, a country like Iran wanted to acquire nuclear weapons and Israel was against it, instead of bombing Iran, what you can do is create a regime, a grouping of countries that come together or coalesce around a specific issue, by which they can solve that issue. And that's what the Iran deal is. I forget the name of the Iran deal right now, but the Iran deal is all about accomplishing the goal of limiting Iran's nuclear weapon production and capability. So it tries to solve goals. It tries to solve problems. Regimes and liberalism, they try to solve problems that go beyond or involve a lot of states. Climate change, again, another great example. Liberalism and regimes try to bring states together to solve a specific goal. So many people think that the future is liberalism, the future of the order is liberalism, but this can be criticized as Western imperialism because not many countries want this specific system. Like, you can ask Iraq in 2003 how they feel about it. You can ask Afghanistan or Libya today or Syria today whether or not they think liberalism is a good idea, whether or not they want that political system. In many respects, liberalism is a very imperialist, it's a Western imperial theory. Where we might not look at it like that, but I believe, I feel safe enough to say that. So, as opposed to realism is a very self-help approach, looking at the military, looking at military perspectives. It is expansionary in its offensive variant, but liberalism is also very expansionary. So there's those two theories. Another great theory is constructivism. And many students find that constructivism is a very difficult theory to digest. But the main thing you have to understand is the idea of social construction. So something is a social construction if you and I, or a group of people, agree that it is true. So example, this water bottle is green. If we all agree that this is green, then it's green. I mean, that's basically how it works. The United Kingdom can have nuclear weapons. Iran cannot. North Korea cannot. It's a threat. That's because of our way of interacting with the UK as opposed to interacting with Iran. UK is our friend. Canada is our friend. But Iran is not, and so we're going to worry about their intentions. It's not a materialist theory. Realism and liberalism are materialist perspectives, not constructivism. This is about social facts, and it's an ideational approach. Ideational is a fancy word for idea. You're looking at ideas, right? You're looking at perspectives, or you're looking at social constructions. So anarchy is what states make of it. This really just means that anarchy, how we treat other countries, is determined by our ideas that create their identity. So relations with other countries are social. They're not material, like the realists and the liberals would say. An identity, the identity of somebody, will determine the interest. So if Iran is acquiring nuclear weapons, we're going to say, the United States will say, They can't have it. We have to make sure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons, right? That's what we're going to do. Whereas the UK can have it. You get it? I'm sure. Kind of beating a dead horse. But the idea is that we live in a world where our identity and our ideas are shaped by our social interactions. And the norms, the what should, right? We say it should be this way. That's a product of our social understanding of the world, right? So there's a lot of should in liberalism, but also in constructivism, less so with realism. So the norms and ideas can change, they can evolve, and they can push actors to behave in different ways. Women's rights, all of that good stuff has evolved with time. And that we can expect the same thing with our security and our security ideas. So Alexander Wendt, he was the one who invented this theory. He's a really brilliant fellow. I mean, to take something from sociology and put it into international politics, you got to give the man credit. He did a good job. So there's three basic types of anarchies, the way that we interact with other countries. There's the Hobbesian and the Kantian. There's also the Lockean, but we don't need to talk about that. Let's talk about the two extremes. Hobbesian. Thomas Hobbes, he's what you would call a state of nature philosopher. So he thought that, because of his experience in the English Civil War, he thought that man is a violent individual, and it's a war of all against all out there in the world. Without government, it's a war of all against all. Right? I tend to believe that. Without a government, maybe things will go crazy. So we have to treat others as if they were an enemy. With Kant says that no, human beings are actually good. There's some element of goodness in them, and love and kindness. And so we can be friends with others. We can cooperate with others, and everything will just be honky-dory, So that's the culture of anarchy, the types of anarchy that Wendt talks about here. So the way that we interact with other countries is based on our perception of these actors, right? So we're going to move on to military security. And I mean, this seems like it's a very natural jump. So military security has been prioritized by many governments. Not all, not the Europeans for sure, but the main three powers, the main three great powers in our multipolar world. Multipolar meaning more than two. Bipolar means two. Unipolar means one. So our international order today is determined in a multipolar sense by the three giants, the United States, Russia, and China. And military security has an objective dimension as well as a subjective dimension based on what is and what we perceive. So in terms of military security, we're talking traditional ideas of security. So we're looking at other countries and their militaries. So if there's a country on our border that's massing troops, if China decides to build a military base in Mexico, the United States should be alarmed and should act in kind to balance against that threat or to even neutralize that threat. And war remains a legitimate instrument of politics. What I mean by that, Clausewitz said that war is simply politics by other means. Politics in the sense of you're trying to achieve a political goal. What is your political goal? It's survival. It's probably going to be making sure that your enemy cannot hit you and destroy a specific area or reduce your ability to carry out a warfare on your own terms. So when, again, I'll use this example, when Russia was amassing troops on the Ukrainian border, Zelensky and Ukraine did nothing to balance against that threat. And Putin is carrying on this war not because he's an evil man or he's selfish, but if from a realist perspective, he's a very rational individual. He sees Ukraine as going too far to the west, joining NATO, probably going to join the EU, and they have an army. And given Russia's history of being invaded 3 times through Ukraine and the east, they're going to determine Ukraine to be a very special country to their national interests and going to act in a specific way. And that explains the war in Ukraine in a very simple way. Now in Taiwan is a very interesting case. If you look at the map, you can see Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and so forth, and other countries. And this represents the first island chain. If China was to capture Taiwan, they would acquire deep water. And that means their submarines, very noisy things, will be able to go deep underwater and navigate under the water into the west coast of the United States. And the United States, if it was a rational actor, would not want to accept that. So it's very reasoned in terms of military security that one would want to neutralize that particular issue to make sure that your country remains safe and secure. Now, military power, to be secure, one needs military power. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You need military power in order to check your opponent, to make sure they don't overpower you in case they attack. In order to balance against a threat, you need military capability. A lot of people look at the appeasement of 1936 of Adolf Hitler and say, oh, that was a bad idea. We shouldn't have appeased Hitler. We should have taken him out when we had the chance. Well, with what? Right? For the past 20 years before 1936, after World War I, liberalism took over and everybody demilitarized and decided that that was in their best interest. No, that's not a good idea, right? You don't want to do that. You want to maintain your military capability. That's called internal balancing, maintaining a military capability, your own. But let's say you're tiny and you're really concerned about the great power on your border. Well, you can bandwagon with them. So instead of Ukraine fighting Russia, instead of Ukraine doing everything to upset Russia or to create insecurity for Russia, what Ukraine could have done was enter into a security pact with Russia and say, look, we're cool, right? There's no need to be upset. We'll work together and make sure that we, do some exercises. At the same time, you can trade with the U.S. as long as you maintain a balanced approach with Ukraine, with Russia. Ukraine will have been fine. But because Ukraine is so insecure, they wanted to move closer with the United States. They wanted to join NATO. So what Ukraine was trying to do was join NATO and gain an alliance with NATO. And an alliance is great to have. Especially if you're a weak country. If I was the strongest country, I wouldn't want alliances. I would want to do everything myself. But I am not a strong country. I'm just a professor. But in the case of this theory, an alliance is great because you get another country to help you in your, fight your battles, to make sure that at least you survive. You might have to do the larger country's bidding, but, the members of NATO seem to enjoy the alliance with the United States. They enjoy it so much that many of them are not meeting their 2% military spending requirement, right? So in that particular case, we're seeing how alliances can make you lethargic. So you can basically neglect your responsibility to help yourself, right? Another good idea is to acquire a nuclear deterrent. Now, a deterrent is trying to convince your enemy not to attack you. You want to make sure that your enemy knows if you attack me, right, you are going to get destroyed. It's not going to be an easy one. You're going to get destroyed. I think Singapore called this the hedgehog strategy. You know, hedgehog, cute little thing, but they curl up into a ball, spikes pointing out. Kind of like the phalanx in ancient Greece, right? If you take a look at a picture of the phalanx, spears pointing out, shields up, beautiful thing, beautiful thing. But you want to make sure you convince. It's a communications thing. You want to convince your enemy that it's going to be very costly. And the thing about nuclear weapons is that it makes warfare very expensive. So you don't necessarily want to attack a nuclear power because you're worried, hey, they might use a nuclear strike on me. They might take out a significant part of my military. You don't want that, right? You want to maintain your ability to survive, right? Isn't survival is part and parcel of security? So the good thing about nuclear weapons is that, hey, at least, hey, you have a deterrent, right? And deterrence, again, very important. Another thing that we have to look at is regime security. So regime security is all about the state itself, its internal security, its governmental authority. You want to maintain the ability to survive. Part of that, to study that, you have to move your attention. Right now, we've been focusing a lot on United States, Russia, and China. You have to go down to other countries or weak states in the international system. And weak states, they are typically weak in the sense of they lack capacity. They have political divisions in their government. Sometimes they have a terrorist as a part of their government. If you look at Lebanon, Hezbollah is part of their government. They suffer from economic difficulties, dependence on other countries. Maybe they're resource poor. Maybe their population is impoverished. There's major corruption, social divisions. Maybe they disagree on the very identity of the country. Like, again, Lebanon is a great example. Nigeria is another example. So these weak states, they have a very different dynamic. They're subject to political violence. But again, weak states is all about that lack of internal capacity and the competition from other areas of power. So maybe there's a terrorist or an organized criminal unit operating freely within the country. And that sort of thing is going to affect the overall survival of the country. But the threat doesn't come from outside. Like in realism and liberalism, the threat comes from inside, right? So there's effective states like the United States, right? They have these institutions. We take these institutions for granted, right? We take the fact that there's law and order in most parts of the country, maybe not in some cities where a lot of the defund the police movement really took hold, and we're seeing a lot of crime in those areas. Well, in other countries, weak states, the government is the criminal body, right? So the crime has penetrated the government, and crime is part of the way the country works. So in Afghanistan, bribery was an essential part of getting anything done. If you want something done via the government, you'd have to pay somebody off. It's things, again, we take these things for granted in this country. In Somalia, you have if you're rich enough, you can afford your own private military company to protect you from other violence in other areas. And so the long-term costs of weak states is that they never truly develop in a robust sense, in a way that they can survive in the long run. It's quite, it's very sad actually. a lot of these countries with such a rich history succumb to tribalism or warlords, different ethnic identities. Like Nigeria is interesting. There are hundreds of ethnic and tribal allegiances that cut across the country, major religious differences. We're going to get into that in the following chapters on post-colonialism and how these countries were, managed after the decolonization period, the independence period. It's really when they were independent that they truly began to realize, hey, it is hard to run a country, and maybe because that state-centric understanding of international politics, or domestic politics rather, is a Western idea. And because we are focused so much on states and realism and liberalism and all that stuff, we have to talk about diplomacy. So I'm a big fan of diplomacy. I don't like war in the sense of it's not my first option, right? War is a risk, right? You might lose. So a lot of people are talking about how we need to step in on the side of Ukraine, do more to help Ukraine. I don't think we can. I mean, the United States is already overextended and almost broke. I mean, if you look at the debt, we have inflation, a lot of economic instability, political instability. And I'm not sure another war is going to help. I mean, I don't know if it's going to achieve something. And if you think about it, who's going to win in a war between the United States and Russia? Certainly you might think the United States because, numerically, more technologically advanced. It's China. If China sits on the sidelines and the United States and Russia go to war, ultimately China will win the century. The century. So we need to start thinking about diplomacy, right? I think that's where I fit in the most, right? I'm not a military guy, but I see that diplomacy is first. And diplomacy helps resolve the potential for conflict. Diplomacy helps reduce the tension. It's about negotiation. It's about, hey, I give here and you give here. Pulling back, right? Kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. You could have, the United States and the Soviet Union could have easily went to war. And maybe we wouldn't be here today. But thankfully, diplomacy won out. The Americans pulled out their missiles from Turkey. The Russians pulled out their missiles from Cuba. We go back to square one. Isn't that great? So coercive diplomacy is like carrots and sticks. Okay, so think of carrots and sticks. A carrot is a little incentive, right? If I want you to do something, I'm going to give you a little carrot. Hey, I want you to call me so we can talk. I give you a little carrot, a little 3% extra credit. But really, I just want to feel useful, right? So that's why I have these little calls, because I want to feel useful. Sticks are for when the carrot fails. That's when you threaten violence or you use violence. So coercive diplomacy has been used to solve specific great power confrontations, but also stop violations of human rights, terrorism, and even the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So it's about trying to achieve peaceful resolution of conflicts and conflicts of interests. So you want to have these threats. You want to use threats. If you don't do this, I'm going to bomb a city, or I'm going to take out your installation somewhere, or I'm going to kill one of your nuclear scientists, like the Israelis are doing in Iran. It's everything short of full-scale conflict, but it's about resolving crisis. It's about influencing your enemy. It's about trying to show that there's much more to gain from cooperation and compliance than otherwise, right? escalation could be limited and then expand. You don't want to just go boom all the way. You want to go and you want to creep it up a little bit. But you do realize that once you reach a certain point, it's no longer diplomacy. Now you're getting into the potential for full-scale conflict. And again, remember, coercive diplomacy is all about limiting the chances of conflict, right? So we want to make sure that whatever problem that we have is solved without going all the way, right? But everything hinges upon this idea of achieving a specific goal, right? Again, you have to achieve a specific goal through the use of coercive diplomacy. But you also risk escalation. So how can we succeed? Well, in the PowerPoint slides I have, there's a slide called Requirements for Success, the George and Simmons framework. All right? You want to look at the specific conditions. So you have to have an objective. In every war, in every conflict, in everything that you do, in every coercive diplomatic exercise, there has to be an objective. What is your objective? And it better be clear, and it better be concise, because sometimes conflicts tend to spill over into things that don't matter, and that's what we don't want. You also have to be motivated. You also have to have the clear sense of urgency that if this thing is not solved, it's going to lead to something else. That's number 4. I jumped a point. You also have to have the right leader, right? If you have a leader like Carter, you might not be in a very good position. Carter was not a great leader. Kennedy was a very good leader. In that one example, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very good. Maybe he got lucky, but the Bay of Pigs was a complete disaster. Ronald Reagan was a great leader too. I don't like talking about I don't think Bill Clinton had any real foreign policy successes. Neither did Bush, and Obama. Yeah, the Red Line fiasco in Syria, which really hurt credibility of the United States. You have to have strong domestic support. So you have to have your people, the citizens, have to be willing to go along with your goal. If you don't have the citizens' support, they're going to put pressure on you to stop, and that's the last thing you want, because you don't want, because the election is coming up, you want to win, and you kind of, if the population is not happy, that means you probably have to change your goal, and that means that everything that you already looked at in the list is going to fizzle away. You also have to inspire others to follow you. So you need international support. Before Donald Trump, everybody used to buy Iranian oil. There were sanctions on Iran. Everybody bought Iranian oil. Japan bought Iranian oil. There was no real support here, like in the international community, to actually put the screws on to Iran. Then Trump comes in, and he says, stop buying Iranian oil, and everybody said, okay. Right? They stopped. So you have to gain that international support. We're seeing international support right now with Europe regarding the Biden administration's economic war against Russia. However, everybody's still buying their oil and gas, right? Even the United States is buying Russian oil and gas. So you tell me, right? You have to also inspire a fear in your enemy. It's all about conveying, communicating. Something bad's going to happen if you don't listen to what I'm saying. Something very bad is going to happen. You don't want to be on the receiving end of what's coming. So please adjust your behavior. There's also, you need to clarify how you're going to settle. You need to allow your opponent the ability to save face. I mean, that's very important. You don't want to humiliate your opponent. You want to leave an avenue open so they can say, well, maybe it's better if I played ball rather than objecting to and fighting with, the country, right? So again, you want to make sure that you solve this problem, and you want to offer inducements along the way to gain the compliance of your enemy, and to make sure that your adversary will not do this again in the future. And I think that's why the Iran deal is just so sketchy. It's like Iran has the ability to have nuclear weapons or create nuclear weapons in the next couple of months. They said it. They said they're going to do it. Did they? No, they didn't say they were going to do it. Excuse me. They said that they had the ability to do it, which is enough for me, right? I mean, it's enough for me. So we covered a lot of ground in this very short summary. But, this is just to summarize some of the major themes in the readings that you're going to read this week. And I hope you find it productive and worthwhile to watch these little videos. Again, you can listen to them in your car on your way to work, or you can, listen to them and enjoy them as you like. Anyway, thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll shoot another one next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.